Welcome back to day 2. I hope, I think this video will not be nearly as long as the last one. I intended these to be about 15 minutes. So anyway, let me get on with it then. I have developed a chronology for Billy Pilgrim's life. And I want to come back to that question or that issue of whether or not we can piece things together and being more informed about where all of this came from in Billy's life if we were able to look at it in a more linear fashion. So I think we can assume, I don't know if any of you are thinking that the Tralfamadorians were intended to be real, but I think that we can assume that they are figments of his imagination. But I think if we look through this chronology, it might be easier for us to see just how this came about. I think we can reasonably think of maybe 4 different periods in the novel with regard to Billy's life. So Billy before the war, and this is a part of the chronology I developed. I'm putting on the course page the entire one, but these first 2 slides, it's kind of too big to put it all on one screen, on one slide here. But I'm using the beginning and the end for the purposes of this video. So I'm thinking about like 4 periods: Billy before the war, Billy during the war, Billy after the war, but before the plane crash, which I think is the motivation or the instigator of his final, producing of the story of the Tralfamadorians. So about the early part of Billy's life, I think I was talking about this earlier, and I think we can all agree that Billy was challenged mentally, even from the early things. And here are some of the events that we have kind of talked about already that make him someone who is very, say, sensitive or challenged. And this first part of the chronology includes his time in the war, and the experiences there are not insignificant. Sent to war, he was shot at twice. He was tormented by some of his fellow soldiers, like Roland Weary. He was imprisoned. He experienced the firebombing of Dresden and saw Edgar Derby shot by a firing squad for stealing a teapot. And then he is discharged and sent home. In the third period of these 4, the period from the time Billy left the war and came home and before the plane crash, we know, at least the way he's presented in the novel, we know that he is not right. But the outside world does not seem to be that aware of it. I mean, he has his job as an optometrist. He has his marriage, and he has a couple of kids. He is elected to a position for the Lions Club. He gives speeches. So some of those things, not on this slide, but if you look at the whole chronology, you see some of these other accomplishments, if you want to call them that. But we know that he's not right throughout this time. But it's the plane crash and the physical damage that it does with his fractured skull, but also the awareness that he is the only one to have survived that. And again, the feelings that he must have had of being one of the few people to survive the bombing of Dresden. That question of, why me, that has come up before, is pretty significant. But I think this is certainly what has put Billy, over the top, and what brings about the story that he develops in his own mind. That he has a message for the world that is brought about by his connection with the Tralfamadorians. if we look at it chronologically, there's a pretty quick succession of events. We have the plane crash, and then when he's in the hospital, his wife dies of carbon monoxide poisoning on when she's on the way to the hospital to see him. And I don't remember exactly how long it is. He's in the hospital. He's sent home, and then his daughter Barbara is taking care of him, and then he just kind of skips out and goes to New York City one day, where he wants to get on TV to tell the story of the Tralfamadorians and the story of the fourth dimension. He doesn't get on TV, but he gets on a radio talk show, and then he also, when he gets back to Ilium, New York, he writes letters to the editor of the local newspaper. And then his daughter Barbara, confronting him, says, "You never mentioned these Tralfamadorians before the plane crash, so this should be our cue that this is what set him off." But just to kind of walk through like where the story of the Tralfamadorians comes from, let's consider this. So after Billy leaves the hospital and he goes home, and I mean, you remember probably, he is really in a bad way. He's in bed. His daughter Barbara is giving him a lot of crap, and he's like in bed with the heat is off because a mouse has bitten through the cord, and so this is the daughter calls the furnace guy, and so he's in bed all this time with the electric blanket on. So, and he doesn't notice anything. He doesn't notice when it's cold. He doesn't know when it's hot. He's just a big mess, But amidst all this, he is able to sneak out and go to New York. And in New York City, he has a couple of experiences which kind of gives us clues as to his state of mind and where he gets his story, his mission from. So we find out that he goes to this adult bookstore where there's all kinds of pornography in the back of the store, but he notices that there are Kilgore Trout novels in the front, and he gets very excited about that. So he finds, he looks at a number of the books, and he finds this one called Big Board, and then it has in it a story about an earthling man and woman who were kidnapped by extraterrestrials, and they were put on display in a zoo on a planet called Zircon 212. So he has not. I mean, I know it's kind of difficult to follow because the novel goes back and forth in time all the time, but this is really the first time that he is getting information. He said he had read the novel before, way back when, but this coming at a time, he's looking at the novel after the plane crash, when his mind is really at odds, tells us a lot. Okay. And then, in the same adult bookstore, when he's at the cash register where he's going to pay for the book he wants to buy, out of the corner of his eye, he saw, this article on a magazine about Montana wild hag. Now, even though in the novel Montana has been talked about a lot, and so Billy says he knew where Montana wild hag really was. Of course, she was back on Tralfamador taking care of the baby, but that they had that together. But this is really the first time chronologically that he has, mentioned her, except in the many moments where he is unstuck in time. She is mentioned many times, but this is really where she appears chronologically. So he sees the novel by Kilgore Trout about the Earthlings, the man and woman being abducted. He sees the porn star of Montana Wild Hack on a magazine cover, and this really becomes the core of the story that he begins to tell, or that he goes and he can't get on a TV show, but when he gets on a radio show, he starts telling everybody about flying saucers, um, and he gets expelled from the show. But this is really, I think, where it happens. And then when he returns home from New York City, he sends a letter to the editor to the local paper to be able to try to get his message out. So he's really insistent about his mission. His daughter Barbara thinks he's senile, and was giving him a hard time. But he really feels that he has this calling to a much higher thing than mere business. He was doing nothing less now, he thought, than prescribing corrective lenses for earthling souls. Right, so this is kind of an interesting metaphor that Vonnegut uses, is that Billy is by profession an optometrist. So having corrective lenses for earthling for people's sight, but now he's looking at this more metaphorically as a mission for corrective lenses by giving people the mindset of his little green friends on Tralfamadore. So this story that Billy develops is, obviously like a coping mechanism. He's seen so much death and destruction that nobody can really bear. That he comes up with this different way of looking at the world. What is, also really, I think, for me, fascinating is that this is, in many ways, a parallel to what Vonnegut is doing with his novel. Is that he's been having trouble writing. It took him 20 years to write this novel, and he winds up, like Billy, kind of telling a Tralfamadorian novel or a Kilgore Trout novel that is a way of trying to explain the postmodern absurdity of the universe. Speaking of optometrists and their corrective lenses, I mean, there were a lot of optometrists in this novel and a lot of jokes about it. But I wanted to, before we end this video, mention another shtick that Vonnegut uses that is, I think it's really cool, but it has to do with the barbershop quartet that shows up in several places in the novel. They're called the Four-Eyed Bastards, or the Febs for short. It doesn't stick out very much. You might just be reading through and see that this is another comic thing that he throws in there, but it is really a very significant one as well. I mean, it's one of the most poignant and disturbing, but also incredibly effective images I know of in literature to convey a sense of horror and grief, and to do it as a comic device. How does one do that? All right, so this first time when we meet them, they are doing a song on the plane that's on the way to the optometrists convention, that the plane crashes and everybody dies except for Billy. So the plane took off without incident. The moment was structured that way. There was a barbershop quartet on board. They were optometrists too. So when the plane was safely aloft, the machine that was Bill's father-in-law asked the quartet to sing his favorite song. They knew what song he meant, and they sang it. And it went like this. And we're not going to look at that song because it's a dirty song, so we'll just pass over it. But these four guys, right, so there's four of them, these four guys begin singing that song. Okay, so now that previous passage was from page 197 in our text. This one, we jump ahead to page 220, although chronologically it is several years earlier. It's like 1964, and it's the occasion of Billy's anniversary. Billy and Valencia are celebrating their anniversary. And they have there, because all the people at the party are optometrists and their wives, or and so they have engaged the barbershop quartet, the Febs, once again, to sing at this anniversary. And so we have, again, the song, This Gang of Mine, and we have some of the words from that. So we'll try to pay attention to these words because they're going to pop up again. All right, so Billy finds himself upset by the song on the occasion. Why? Okay, so what's going on here? We know that Billy is not right. But what is it about the singers, the barbershop quartet, that is bothering him? Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen what a barbershop quartet, is like, or heard what they're like, but they're very intricate harmonies, and they're always a cappella. But if you look at them when they're singing, their faces are convorting in many different ways to get highs and lows, and they kind of look like they're in pain. So if you look at the way that it's described here, but he missed one. He has the quartet made slow, agonized experiments with chords intentionally sour still, unbearably sour, and then a chord that was suffocatingly sweet, and then some sour ones. Again, Billy had powerful psychosomatic responses to the changing chords. I mean, if you wanted to think of an analogy, if you look at sometimes rock bands when they're performing, especially like a lead guitarist or something, when they're doing a solo, they have to be playing that instrument as if that they're in great agony and their face is twisted and everything. So this is the kind of image that Vonnegut is trying to depict, is four faces singing in this really tight way in which their faces are, making all kinds of different expressions that often maybe look like they're in pain. And then again, just so we can make the connection on the next slide, think of these lyrics to the song, "The old fellows and gals, so long forever." Okay, so it's a goodbye thing. So now we move ahead a few pages to 227, but we're actually going back in time again to the war when Billy was in Dresden, and this is the morning after the destruction of the entire city. All right, so we haven't really talked that much about, this is 135,000 people killed in a flash, more than the people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. So it is a total destruction of an entire city, and Billy and the other American prisoners and their four guards who are with them, and then during the night they hear everything that's going on, and the next morning is when they go out. Dresden was like the moon now, and nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everyone else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. Try to imagine that. Okay, so the guards drew together instinctively, rolled their eyes. They experimented with one expression and then another, said nothing, though their mouths were often open. They looked like a silent film of a barbershop quartet. All right, so this is why Billy was so distressed at the party. He might not even been able to articulate what it was, but when he saw those guys singing and gesticulating with their faces, the image of these four guards who, try to imagine what their faces looked like when all of the city and the people that they knew, that where they lived, it was their home, and everything is wiped out. Trying to think of what their faces would have looked like. And in So Long Forever, they might have been singing Old Fellows and Pals. So long forever, old sweetheart and pals. So, it's disjointed, and the things are far enough away from each other that we may not really see just what an agonizing image that it but you know, if you think about it, it really kind of is very moving. So, okay, so anyway, we're going to end here, and then we'll be ready to finish up next time.